Hi, this is Dennis with Second Chance Tackle. I'm going to do a two-way thing today, answer two questions in one. The first one is from Anthony, a viewer, who said, I'm going kayak fishing. Is it better to have a star drag versus a lever drag, and what are the differences? And then the second one, I've got questions from time to time. How does a lever drag differ technologically from a star drag? In other words, how are they designed and how do they work? So let's talk a little bit about both. I'll give you the short pitch on the lever drag versus the star drag from a kayak or just general purpose fishing, because they're used in the ocean as well. And then we'll go into the technology behind them and show you. So this is a setup. This is a Shimano Corvallis. It's on a 7-foot pole. It's a casting pole. It has what's commonly referred to as the star drag. In this case, it has 5 points, but those can vary. You can have 4, 3, or more. And the notion on that is you can tighten this down, and in tightening that star drag down, you're going to apply more drag pressure, and that's going to control the rate that the line can run out on when you've hooked into a fish. On the star drag, typically these reels are known as set it and forget it. In other words, find the proper tension for your spool when fighting a fish, set it to that tension by tightening your star lever drag, and then don't touch it. Just go fishing. When you hook a fish, you'll have that fight built into this reel, and just crank away, and generally you're in good condition. The reason for set it and forget it is it's not very finite in its adjustments, and if you're going to try and adjust a star drag during a fight, you risk the chance of over tightening to the point where the line snaps. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, what a star drag does. Star drags were not a new technology. Star drags are credited back to Julius and Edward von Hoff back in the early 1900s. Prior to the star drag coming into play, the only drag you had was your thumb, and the thumb would hold the spool as you were cranking, and that thumb pressure would be what's controlling how much line goes out during a fight. But they came up with an internal mechanism for the drag pressure. They patented it in the early 1900s, and it really has not changed much since. They took the leather thumb guard that used to be on the outside, put it on the inside, and we'll show you again the technology in part 2 of this. But this is essentially a kayak setup with a star drag using a fairly good size inlet or inshore ocean type of a reel, the Shimano Corvallis, and set it and forget it. So the other alternative then is these new compact lever drags that they have out on the market now. They make these in all sizes, including right up to the big fish size, like you see on wicked tuna or shark fishing or the like. In this case, this is comparable, although certainly more capable of the landing the bigger fish than the other. This is a Poseidon reel. I think the price point on this is around $150 or so. It's a lever drag, and here the lever controls the tension on the spool. So in free spool mode, there's zero tension, and as you move your lever up, sometimes there's a button here called first strike. If you move it to the first strike position, you can see you still have some pretty good tension on it, where I can still move it by my hand. And as you move it all the way over to the other full strike, then it's much more difficult to turn. And with this adjuster knob, you can move it to where you've totally locked this down, and also that you've improved first strike tension and so on. So the idea with this one is it's much more flexible while you're landing a fish to just run your hand to that lever and make that adjustment, throwing it forward for a little bit more, backing it off if you think that you got more fight in that fish and you need to play that fish longer, and so on. So those are the two technologies. Both of them are nice. Both of them come in compact forms. It's kind of, are you fishing set it and forget it, or are you fishing with more predatory fighting type fish or you may need that adjustment during the fight process, and if you do, then certainly the lever drag is going to work better. From a max drag standpoint, I believe that the lever drag has more max drag than the typical star drag setup. But again, in kayak fishing, you're probably not getting into those 40, 60-pound type fish that the max drag is going to be that much more important in terms of the differences. So let's go to part 2 then. Let's look at the technologies behind them. And again, as I mentioned, these two are more in line with river fishing. Here's 2 bigger reels. These are Pflugers. Here's a Pfluger with a lever drag setup. Again, kind of free spool it, and then first strike, second strike kind of a routine here. I think that's the Pfluger Contender, and then here's a Pfluger Contender with the star drag setup. Same kind of idea. And this one is going to be, again, if you want to use that set it and forget it kind of a note, set it to the right tension and just go deep. This one you're going to have more variability. You need to increase your drag. You want to back it off a little bit as you're going through the process and so on. So what's inside? What makes the difference between these two? So there's really 2 setups. There's the star drag setup, and here's a bridge from a star drag. This is not the bridge that's inside the Pfluger, but this is a typical setup for a star drag. And here's your typical setup for a lever drag. This one is not the Pfluger, this one's an Okuma Titus. But again, for illustration purposes, it's going to do fine. Let me go with the simpler one, the one that's over 100 years old now in design, and show you what makes a star drag work. So first and foremost, you have the star drag adjuster. This isn't the drag, this is simply the adjuster. And if we take that off, typically you're going to find it's on a gear sleeve. This is a pen reel. There's going to be a spacer which is going to go through the case, right? Almost all the times on these you're going to have a case like this, and you're going to need some kind of spacer to get down to the gearing, otherwise the gears would rub on the case. And then you have a drag stack, and the drag stack is simply, or most of the time, of course this one isn't going to cooperate with me. Didn't realize this would be a little bit more difficult to get off. Grab a pliers here. You're going to have a series of metal washers and a series of, well, at the original point it was leather washers. They've since come up now to the point where it's carbon tex and some more advanced type of features and functions. I'm just going to lay this out for you. For whatever reason, these things have been in there a long time and they're a little sticky, but they can come out. And one more, right? Okay, so this design allows a main gear, which is what this is, to spin freely on the shaft. So without tension, this main gear is just going to go about its way of doing what it does. You typically have, in this case, this is a 6 drag washer setup. You typically have 2 keyed washers, and they're oval. They're not round. They have 2 flat sides, 2 rounded sides. And then you have an eared washer that has a fully rounded center, and it has 2 ears sticking out of it. Think of it as the face with 2 ears. It's probably why they call it eared. Sometimes they use other terms for it. And then you have 3 fabric washers in between, originally leather. Now in this case with this pen reel, it's HT100 drags here. Okay, so the first fabric washer goes in, and then the next one only can go on the flat sides of these of the gear sleeve. So what does that tell you? That tells you that as this reel is cranking, you have a way to apply pressure to connect this main gear to the gear sleeve, because that's not going to move. The next one up is then a fabric, and these are the ones that are providing you the drag area to give you the variability in the tension or the slip factor in that stack. Now you have the eared washer. Now the ear washer can spin around that sleeve. As you see, there's nothing holding that to the sleeve. However, those 2 points, there's 2 holes or slots in the main gear, and that locks the washer to the main gear, so that now those 2 will spin in unison, and that you got a hold there. And then the last one, again, fabric, and then the last one on top is also one of these with the 2 flat sides that lock your gear sleeve so that it'll only turn when the gear sleeve turns. So what does that do? It provides you a slip factor here, and with no tension on it, you can still turn that main gear with no problem. So how do you lock these down to the point where you can have the variability? Well, it's all on pressure applied to the stack, alternating between the washers that are holding the gear sleeve and the washer that's holding the main gear. And in this case, they put a spacer in there, and then they put the star adjuster on. And the star adjuster is going to enable you to limit or increase the tension on those washers on the stack. I'm just getting this thing threaded here. And as you increase the tension on the stack, we'll see that this spacer is going to push that down. Now you've got, with that tension on the stack, you've got this gear sleeve, and you have the main gear turning. And if you need more pressure, you compress more by turning to the right, and if you need less pressure, you back it off. And again, now you can see I can turn that gear without turning, well, it's kind of tough in this situation, but if I had a handle, you would see that I can turn the main gear. Let's use pliers for now. Turn the main gear without turning the gear sleeve or the handle sleeve. So that's how these work. You have a series of fabric washers in the middle, metal washers that alternate between holding the gear sleeve and holding the main gear. Compress them all down, and they're holding everything tight, and that's where you get max drag in terms of a traditional star drag setup. So what makes a lever drag work, and why is it different? So a lever drag has, as we mentioned, this is an Okuma Titus. This is not the reel I showed you before. It has a lever. That lever controls the amount of tension or the amount of pull of a drag system. And in this case, it says if you tighten it to the right, and I think this is always the case, if you tighten it to the right, you have a preset button that will start at a certain level, and as you, if you need more tension, you can crank that in. Well, what's that thing doing there anyway, and what's going on with the lever, and why is this different than what I just showed you in that setup? So to do that, there's really a 2-part question here. What's going on the front end, and what's going on the back end? So let's take this off. This is a screw. This is a handle screw. You'll see there's a screw inside the cap. There's a little water ring or an O-ring. It kind of sits over this assembly. And then we have a ramp. This is interesting to note here. We have a ramp. We have 2 slots, and we have a ramp. It might be a little bit more difficult to see, but you'll notice that when you start here, there's almost nothing. And when you come over here, there's probably a 1/16 or an 1/18 of an inch. And this is a ramp. The same thing happens on the other side. So there's a 2-ramp system, very common in lever drag reels. And what's happening as you turn your lever handle, which has these 2 offsetting studs, triangular studs here, maybe hard to see, but as you're turning your handle, those 2 studs are riding up this ramp, and that's causing the spool, which is threaded, that's what, so we can take this out, it's threaded on that spool, and as it's riding up the ramp, it is pulling the spool shaft forward. So what's going on when it's getting pulled forward? Well, let's open up the spool here and show you. So this is just a spool cap. It's not part of the drag system other than it holds everything in place. Then when you open it up, you have a clutch plate or a face plate or a pressure plate, depending on what you want to call it, inside this reel. And that's a transition piece. So that's going to take the pinion gear that's inside the spool here. When you turn the handle, you're going to turn this gear. This gear is going to turn the spool gear. And if you have no pressure on, that's exactly what's going to happen. You're going to be in free spool. In other words, the spool's going to be able to flow without pressure. So you need to apply pressure to that plate. So here's your plate. This is a plate. It's a face plate. This is your drag. So it's a, in this case, it's a fabric drag. And when you apply pressure from the plate to the drag, that's how you're going to stop the spool. And then almost always in these setups, you will have a bearing and you will have a spring sitting on that axle shaft. And the whole idea behind the spring and the bearing is to control the tension, much like that little gear sleeve or star drag did. So what will happen is, as you take this pressure plate and you push it down, you're connecting with that drag washer, and that's where you're getting your tension. Well, this reel doesn't push down. This has a static where you pull the spool to the, you just pull the whole spool this way to the pressure plate, as opposed to pushing this in the opposite direction. So let's see if we can get this thing set up properly. We'll put the tension cap back on, or trying to put the tension cap back on. There we go. That all goes inside here as we did before. And now you'll see you have this is sticking out, and as you push, you'll notice this can come further out. So that's the effect. That's how you're getting your pressure plate to connect with the drag washer on the fixed spool. And how do you do that? You do that with this ramped system. So you have the lever, you have the two studs, you have the two indentations with the ramp on the adjuster. And most of the time you want to get those indentations right on top of each other to start. That's going to give you the free spool. That's the least tension when you have the studs inside the indentations in the cap overall. This one. So at the moment I have a pin that's missing on this side, which isn't helping me. There we go. Okay. So as you pull then, as you move your, whoops, we're not on. That's probably why this one's in pieces in the box. It probably has a little bit of an issue there. So let's go back and do it the other way. We'll take the studs and we'll get them into the crevice. There we go. Now we'll take the adjuster knob. That's all I can guess, is that this the threading in this adjuster knob must be bad. Okay, at any rate, that's the idea. As you push your lever, you pull your lever, you're coming down off that ramp. That's removing or distancing the clutch plate or pressure plate from the fabric drag. As you go up the scale, you're riding up that lever. That's pulling the whole axle shaft forward. It's engaging the spool to that pressure plate and causing you to have more tension. And then when you get to this is the first strike, here's your, when you go to the second strike there, if this was operating properly, then you're in full lockdown on it, much like you would be in full lockdown if you tighten this all the way down as much as you can. First strike is about halfway, like a quarter of a turn, and then free spool would actually be with all tension off those drag washers inside here. So that's the two different structures behind a lever drag and a Star Drag. Lever drags tend to be a little bit more expensive than the Star Drag models, but again, from fishing, if you're in a set it and forget it mode, in terms of bottom fishing perhaps, riding with a sinker on your line, or just drift fishing and don't have a lot of tension on what you're catching, then a simple Star Drag setup is going to work fine. It's worked fine for over 100 years, and it'll certainly meet your needs. If you're in a situation where you're fighting some predatory fish, you need the adjustability on a on-the-fly basis kind of a deal, and you need to make sure that you have the ability to adjust the drag during the fight depending on the size of the fish or the fight in the fish. Then a lever drag will suit your needs as well. Both of these cast equally well. You don't find too many lever drags, although they're out there, with the level wind feature, because they typically are designed for a bigger fighting fish, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. So I hope you've enjoyed that. It's a tutorial that's been asked for, so I thought I would take the time during these crazy times of this lockdown, this pandemic lockdown, to kind of take these apart and show these to you. So with that, this is Dennis with Second Chance Tackle. If you've enjoyed it, please subscribe. Tell your fishing buddies about it as well. If you have a reel that you want to work on and have some questions about it, please send me them in the questions and comments. If you have a reel that intimidates you but needs service and you're interested in the service, well, I do that as well. So with that, leave the comments. I'll try and answer any questions that you have, and stay safe. This is Dennis with Second Chance Tackle. Thank you for watching.